Hello guys, this is Fireside Chess coming back to you with another YouTube video. And today we're going to be going over different opening traps for both white and black. So now without further ado, let's get started. Our first opening is going to be the Blackburne Shilling Gambit. This isn't a very popular opening because this could easily end up very bad for black. But when played properly, for black, this could end up in a checkmate. So, without further ado, let's get started with the trap itself. So, first, it starts out with e4, e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, bishop to c4, and knight to d4. And now here, there are two responses for white, where one will lead to just having an even position, where tactically it would be a little bit better for white, or it will lead farther down into the trap, which makes it much worse for white and may lead to a checkmate. So now first, let's see what the correct move is. So the best move here would be knight takes d4. Now the continuation of this ends up being e takes d4. Now I play pawn to c3 to threaten the pawn and try to get black's pawn off of d4, either by capturing it or forcing it to move to d3, where it can be taken by our bishop. Or even if black takes the pawn, like this, we end up developing our knight with knight takes c3. But black's best response would be to play bishop to c5, protecting it. Now here, white has to sacrifice bishop to f7 check. This then forces the king to take back with king to f7. Now you bring queen out to h5 check. This ends up causing black to play g6, and we win the bishop on c5. Now one thing to note is that try to not bring out the queen very early out in the opening, because this can end up leading it to just get tossed around and bullied by the minor pieces and pawns, which then ends up giving black a bunch of extra tempos. But here, it's fine because it's leading to a fork, which ends up winning us the bishop, which we then sacrificed. But then the wrong response to the Blackburne Shilling is taking the pawn on e5, which would end up looking better to a more inexperienced player because it's just a free pawn. But this then leads to queen to g5, knight to f7, queen taking on g2, and then rook to f1. And now here, many different things can happen again. White could have taken on h8, taking the free rook there, instead of moving to f1. And then after white takes on h8, black's response would be queen takes h1 check, bishop comes to f1 to protect the king against the check, queen takes on e4 check, bishop to e2, and then bishop to c5. Now this might not look very good for white because black has a big space advantage and a better development lead, but this ends up protecting white from going farther down the trap of Blackburne Shilling. So then after f1, we have queen takes e4 anyway, and bishop to e2. This ends up causing knight to f3 checkmate because now the bishop cannot take this knight on f3 because it's being pinned by the king. And then this causes checkmate because the king cannot run anywhere. It can't block because it's just a knight check. And it can't be captured because the only piece that can capture it is the bishop, which is being pinned. The better response to queen to e4 check is to move the queen in the way. Because now, if black were to play knight to f3, white can just easily play queen to d1, escaping the checkmate. But then the better move here is just black takes on e2, and then bishop takes on e2. So this still ends up being a good trap for black, but as we saw, there's many different ways to counter it. But once you start getting past like this queen to e4 check, it doesn't end up being good for anybody except black. And now, our next trap is the elephant trap in the queen's gambit declined. So this goes d4, d5, which is one response to d4, c4, and then e6. This is what we call the queen's gambit declined, because in the queen's gambit accepted, black ends up taking on c4. But after e6, we have knight to c3, knight to f6, bishop to g5, bishop b to d7, because this knight is coming from b8 to d7, where this knight on f6 could still come to d7. That's just clarifying to whoever is reanalyzing the position. C takes d5, e takes d5, knight takes d5, and now knight takes d5. Because here, after we have pinned this knight to the queen, and we take the pawn here, black could take back, and then this ends up leading to the trap here, where now this knight is being pinned. And then there's knight to d5, bishop takes d8, but then bishop to b4, and then queen to d2. And then king takes on d8. Because now here, white can't even take on b4. So it ends up actually being pretty good for black, because now black can end up winning the queen, and black will end up being a minor piece up with the two knights and bishop to only white's bishop and knight. And that's just the elephant's trap in the queen's gambit declined. And our next trap is called the fishing pole trap. This one goes e4, e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, bishop to b5, knight to f6, king castles, knight to g4. And now, up until knight to g4, this is still pretty standard chess. This is the three knights Roy Lopez, which then if white played knight to c3, ends up being the four knights Roy Lopez. But white castles instead, and then black plays knight to g4. This ends up bringing out the response of h3 from white, and the continuation is h5 defending it. H takes on g4 because you're getting a knight for a pawn, but then h takes g4. And now we see that this is an open file on the king side for the rook. And then there's knight to e1 because it's the best move for white. Queen to h4, and now this is an unstoppable checkmate. Because even if, not the queen, even if knight to f3, we have queen to h1. Then the response is f3, actually giving white an escape hole. And then we play g3, which ends up blocking it up. Rook to f2, but we still play queen to h1, checkmate. But even back when there was h3, there were different ways to play it from white. Instead of playing h3, white could have played rook to e1, which would then bring out the response bishop to c5, because this is now threatening a fork. d4 blocking it, knight takes on d4, knight takes d4, and queen to h4 threatening checkmate on h2. Now we have knight to f3, defending that checkmate and attacking the queen, but then queen takes on f2 check. King to h1, then queen to g1 check, rook takes g1, and then knight to f2 checkmate. So even if white actually did play rook to e1 with this proper combination, it still ends up leading to checkmate for black. But then, even if h3 was played, we have h5, h takes g4, h takes g4, and then instead of knight to e1, there was bishop takes on c6 because there's a knight there. D takes c6, knight takes on e5 because there's a free pawn. You have queen to h4, and it leads to the whole dilemma again. f3, g3, rook to e1, and then queen to h3. But even if white doesn't play bishop to c6, and even plays knight to e1, again we saw queen to h4, but there's knight to f3 as defense, and then we just come to h1. So then that's it for the fishing pole trap. And now we have the Sicilian Siberian trap. This goes e4, c5, d4, c takes on d4, c3, d takes on c3, knight takes c3, developing the knight, knight to c3, also developing the knight, knight to f3, very standard chess. We have c6, bishop to c4, and now we have queen to c7, we have queen to e2, also bringing out white's queen, along with black, knight to f6, king castles, knight to g4, eyeing on f2, h3, knight to d4, attacking the queen, but that does give white the opportunity to just take on d4. And white does play knight to d4, and then that ends up bringing out queen to h2 checkmate. So if white wasn't careful here, this sacrifice ends up drawing away white from defending the h2 square. So then instead of taking on d4, there could have been h takes on g4, taking the knight, and then we win the queen, and then bishop takes on e2. Even though white is still technically an exchange down, since it does stop the checkmate, it still would be favorable. And there's even another response to knight to d4. We have queen to d3, knight to f3 check, queen takes on f3, and this also leads to queen to h2 checkmate. So here, to the Siberian trap, our best response would be h taking on g4, completely disabling the entire checkmate. And that is going to wrap it up for today's traps. We went over 4. And as always, stay safe and make sure to hit the like and subscribe button. Goodbye until next time.